The deal is a deal of a drug dealer and a drug addict. And a substantial part of the European elite have been addicted to the security drug of the United States. They cannot get away from that addiction, and they feel as if their only presence is to work for that kind of transatlantic subservience, because it's not an alliance. An alliance presupposes some kind of dignity and equality.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I've got with me again Evarist Bartolo. Evarist was the former foreign minister of the wonderful island nation of Malta, and he was a parliament member there for many, many years as well. And by now, he's also a regular guest on my show because he always writes brilliant articles and great analysis. His latest piece that he published in the Times of Malta is called A Mirage of the Common Home. The United States has always opposed a pan-European security structure, in which he discusses why we don't have a common European security that includes Russia and Belarus as well. This is what we want to discuss today. So, Evarist, welcome.
Welcome, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to explain actually more than 50 years of history.
Yeah.
Because unless we go back, unless we try to understand history, we will not understand where we are.
Precisely, and this is such a crucial point. And on that article that I will also link in the description, it's free for everybody to read. There's this picture of Gorbachev waving, and of course, the common home we remember as this idea Gorbachev pitched very strongly of now we're going to create in the 1990s we're going to create a common security framework, actually including also the Americans, right? And actually work together, not against each other. How did we lose that chance? Why are we now at a worse moment than at the height of the Cold War again?
I think if we study carefully the documents that have been made available online in the National Security Archive, so these are official documents now of what was discussed in the US cabinet, what was discussed in bilateral meetings between European and American leaders, it becomes very clear. And it was quite a discovery for me, because I was under the illusion, and I must say that sometimes illusions help us cope with harsh reality. I was under the illusion that things were much better 50 years ago when the Helsinki Accord was signed to talk about and try to bring about cooperative security in Europe, security which brings together economics, environment, human rights, political rights. And then I thought that somehow things went wrong after the fall of Berlin and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Reading those documents and analyzing them actually shows that no, right from the beginning, in 1975, the United States did not believe in the Helsinki Accord. We can see in one case, I think it was just after a week, the signatures were put in Helsinki, that Kissinger is telling the cabinet, don't worry, this means nothing. It's not a treaty. It's just a document, and we did it sort of to please the Europeans. Especially, this is a kind of nod to the left, who wanted to build this cooperative security, trying to build détente at that time. Obviously, at that time, it was détente, and it's interesting who were the people who were pushing for détente. To have a working relationship between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And what is interesting, that even the Soviet Union at that time acknowledged that the United States could play an important part in cooperative security in Europe. And that's why it accepted the United States to be a signatory to that accord. But I repeat, from the very beginning, way back, I would say way back, since the foundation of NATO, the United States has always privileged NATO as its main policy tool in Europe. And so it never gave CSCE and even OSCE a chance, because you have a big collision there between NATO and OSCE, because OSCE is inclusive. You include everybody. NATO is exclusive. NATO wants to be against others. So the decision to enlarge NATO meant that you squash, you kill OSCE. And there was no doubt at any moment in these last 50 years what the United States was going to do. Presidents come and go, secretaries of state come and go, but there was one particular priority that they gave, that it should be NATO. And I think, Pascal, what is interesting is that particular episode when Helmut Kohl is invited by Bush to go to Camp David to discuss the security arrangements. And he told him, now listen, there is no way that a united Germany will leave NATO. Because Russia was saying, yes, let's unite Germany, but it should be good to have a neutral Germany instead of Germany as a NATO member. And the Americans said, oh, there's no way we will accept that. So Kohl is invited to Camp David, and Bush tells him, come alone. Don't bring your foreign minister, because your foreign minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, was one of the few voices still saying, let's have a common European security architecture, and that it should be larger than NATO. Because if NATO is larger than the CSCE, what kind of, if it's a military alliance against someone else, how it's not inclusive at all. So Genscher is actually excluded from that meeting, and they are angry at him. And what is interesting is that both Bush and Kohl are angry at him. So in this story, the Europeans are as complicit, part of the European elites, I would say mostly, I would say at the beginning, the center right, especially Christian Democrats. Especially the Christian Democrats, I think especially the German Christian Democrats are complicit in this story. The French tried to keep a kind of autonomy for Europe, tried to take a different position, but even I would say, might be strong language, what I'm going to say now, even in the latest so-called deal between President Trump and European Commission President von der Leyen, the deal is a deal of a drug dealer and a drug addict. And a substantial part of the European elite have been addicted to the security drug of the United States. They cannot get away from that addiction, and they feel as if their only presence is to work for that kind of transatlantic subservience, because it's not an alliance. An alliance presupposes some kind of dignity and equality. But I think right from after the Second World War, the United States made clear that it would rebuild Western Europe, rebuild it on its terms, rebuild it to have also very important markets for its industry and for its exports. But it wouldn't want Western Europe to grow beyond a certain stage. Yes, don't be dependent on us. Don't ask us for pocket money all the time, but don't become an independent individual who leaves our relationship to do what you want to do, even if it's in your interest to do that. So time and time again, NATO has been used actually to keep the members in line, more than, because although over the years there is talk of the Soviet threat and of invasion, literally, if one studies the history of NATO, it's to keep the members in check rather than to keep someone away. Because when they, for example, say, we don't want missiles on our territory. I say, no, remember, you are members NATO, and especially the Germans were being told, if you don't accept missiles on your territory, who else in Europe is going to accept them? So please, not only must you be members in NATO, but you must accept also what we impose on you, because France is not always sort of compliant. But then if you look at the Italian Christian Democrats, for example, who still tried to build a kind of independent foreign policy where they would have some room for maneuver to build a good relationship with North Africa, with the Arab countries, with the Middle East, with the Gulf countries. Then the United States was not happy. And I found it quite an interesting remark. Recently, I was reading the autobiography of Willy Brandt, where he says that Kissinger actually said, we prefer to have the Europeans as individual dwarves than becoming a giant. So as much as possible, we want them to be dwarfs so that we can play Berlin against Paris, Paris against London. So we want a united Europe, but again, a united Europe, a united Western Europe, where where it's not united, because the United States was never happy when the Europeans spoke with one voice, when they managed to speak with one voice. So it was always very important for them to have a disunited Europe, which became more disunited with enlargement to the Baltic countries and to the Eastern European countries, and then the talk of New Europe and Old Europe. Yeah. New Europe, which does more what we say, and Old Europe, which sometimes tries to have its strategic autonomy and its strategic sovereignty, which today have become ridiculous. One shouldn't even talk about it.
Yeah, and it needs to be pointed out, God forbid, from an American perspective, that United Europe includes Russia, because then everything is over. So even just something like a beneficial trading relationship with Russia and an energy security relationship is something that literally needs to be blown up and was blown up. Yes. So, the Ukraine war in this sense, like, fulfills several check marks, right? It is on several levels and something that is in the strategic interest of certain groups of America. And I would never, ever ascribe this to all parts. We know that most of our American colleagues are very well-thinking humanists, but we also have these neoconservatives, yes, and the neo Kissingers. I wouldn't say Kissinger is a neoconservative, but I would say Kissinger is one of these very cold-hearted geostrategists who think on this in these nationalistic lines. But the one thing I would like to explore further with you is like this point that never occurred to me, that we actually in the Cold War, we had two chances at having a unified neutral Germany, and it was 2 times blown up by the CDU. I mean, the first one was Adenauer. Had it not been for Adenauer, actually the Americans would have said yes to the because Eisenhower was in favor, was not against the idea pitched by Stalin of a reunified neutral Germany. Exactly. And then a second time it was Kohl together, but then with Bush, against the idea, and saying, like, instead of that, let's sell the idea that a unified Germany inside NATO is good for the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev took it. Gorbachev took that one and swallowed it and said, okay, if it's not neutral, it's at least inside NATO, and it is well defined and not an inch to the east.
It is so sad. It is so sad. I had a friend, an ambassador friend, who was based in Moscow, and he became a friend to Gorbachev when obviously he was not in public life anymore. Also because we have an emotional relationship with Gorbachev. and with Bush to a certain extent, because way back it was in the rough seas of Malta that the first discussion of a common European security home was discussed, but was discussed from the point of view of Gorbachev. There is no sign whatever and no proof whatever and no evidence that Bush ever subscribed to that idea. In fact, when Gorbachev was still talking about let's have a common security home, and on purpose, I'm not even bringing in Yeltsin. So I'm still talking about the good guy, and everyone was saying he is a good guy, Gorbachev is a good guy, and we can do business with him. He loves peace. He wants to save the world from nuclear war. He's ready to give political freedoms to his former sort of, bloc members. But they never believed in the common security home. And even Baker. And when you see these discussions in one-to-one discussions, and they let their guard down, so they don't have to talk diplomatically, which is, officialese and diplomatic language, which when you analyze them means nothing. Even Bush at one point says, listen, the CSCE is a dream. NATO is a reality. So, let's not talk about dreams, but they wanted to make sure that the dream, which was a dream, would not come true. Whereas with NATO, they wanted NATO to actually grow stronger, even at the time when there was talk, even in Western Europe, some had the courage to say, now listen, the Soviet Union has dissolved the Warsaw Pact. So why is there NATO now? Why do we need NATO? Well, because NATO was a tool of the United States to ensure that it would keep the European sort of continent or the European subcontinent subservient to us. And we want to make sure that we can use NATO as that kind of structural dependence, structural submission. So at no point, what was, I would say, duplicitous, and I think it's also perfidy, is to give Gorbachev the illusion that they were going along with him. So they would talk one way with Gorbachev and another way with the Eastern European leaders like Wałęsa, Václav Havel. They would talk differently to those. Confidentially, they would tell them, don't worry, we will enlarge NATO and you will be in it. On the other hand, they would tell Gorbachev, no, we will keep you informed all the time. We don't want to divide Europe again. We want to include you. And to be fair, there were prominent people in the circle of Gorbachev, like Falin, for example, and like even Shevardnadze, telling Gorbachev, this doesn't look good at all. They are leading us a merry dance. They are telling us one thing, but our intelligence actually are telling us that they are preparing to enlarge NATO, and their initial plan of the Defense Department, not of the State Department, was let us enlarge NATO by 2005. By 2005, even Ukraine should have been in it. And so the plan was there, Pascal.
Yeah, and but it must be pointed out that also within the US, this was not a done deal. I mean, people like Jack Matlock, who was on this channel before, and who was the US ambassador to the Soviet Union, worked with Gorbachev and actually with Bush in order to prevent a civil war, and that one they did successfully, right? They did that, and Matlock was adamantly against enlarging NATO. He's in that camp. But the point is, inside the US, that faction actually lost the debate. It was the other one that won over. It was the people who were scheming at the time, but it wasn't a done deal. So it was if the people around Gorbachev warned him of this risk, they warned of a real risk, but not one that was already was already done. It happened then. I mean, it was sealed under Clinton, and probably also the just unimaginable weakness of Russia that it would fall into must have played into that as well. Did you find anything in the archives that also show the progression of that U.S. internal debate about how to go forward?
Yes. So 2 points. Number one, the point that you've just made now about the United States. It would be interesting to analyze that the same process was happening within the European countries, that those politicians who wanted to really have, this kind of subservient relationship with the United States, for what they saw as security reasons. I would say more than for security reasons, because they felt that the world was changing, that Europe was getting weaker, and that the only way they could keep some kind of dominance and primacy was to hang on to the jacket of the United States, that the United States was still a dominant power, and that the only way they saw for the European Union to have some kind of meaningful relationship was to be, to do completely what the United States was doing. This is so sad. There were other Europeans who wanted to take another path, who wanted the European Union to have a good relationship with, yes, with the United States, obviously, but also with China, even with Russia, even with Africa, with Latin America. There was this. But over the years, again, those lost the argument, and those who won were the same ones allying themselves with the United States, who wanted that kind of relationship. From the point of view of the Soviet Union, definitely there were Russian politicians who were telling Gorbachev, and I think Yeltsin was more convinced than Gorbachev, that the Americans were not paying any attention to what the Russians were saying. So again, diplomatically, they would tell the Russians, we don't see you as an enemy anymore. You are past enemies, but you are future partners. But that was just a bit of sugar to make the bitter medicine go down. Because even when you see the discussion that takes place, for example, between the first General Secretary of NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is Manfred Werner, talking to the President of the Duma, by the end of a speech of 15 minutes, where Werner is telling him, we want to be your partners, the President of the Duma tells him, but don't you think that we should have a dialogue instead of lectures? Is this what partnership is about? That you come here to tell us that your three tools now are going to be CSCE, then the European Union, and then NATO. And in fact, it was very clear that it was NATO, NATO, NATO. And in fact, today, they have changed the European Union into NATO. You can't tell the difference between NATO and the EU. When even von der Leyen discussing the deal that she struck in the golf course at Scotland, in the same press conference, she talks about the deal and about NATO. That, the summit of NATO, it's as if, because they are tight, the kind of subservience that the European Union has tied itself now to the United States, landing it in a mess is a problem. Is a problem because I would say that the main problem that the European Union has is itself. It is so weak that instead of painfully addressing its economic and political problems, it blames Russia, it blames the United States, instead of painfully looking at itself and says, listen, we are more tied to the past, even in terms of the economy. Even if you analyze the German economy today, what future does it have? When you see the technology, when you see, and when the European Union today is squeezed not only by the United States, but also by the competitiveness, both technologically and in terms of price, by China and the rising India and Brazil. But the European Union has to learn the humility to deal with these different countries in an equal way, not dictating to them as it used to do before.
And I think that's even worse to the Europeans than subsuming their own foreign policy to that of the United States. Because if Europe has been historically bad at something, then it is at accepting non-whites, non-Europeans as equal partners.
Yes.
They
Yes.
there's something going on, something racial.
And in fact,
it's like, no, you are doing it wrong. And even though we have this whole speech acts of equitability, blah, 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 they don't take that for serious. I mean, if you're not in the same mental mindset, if you're not in the value, if you don't have shared values, if your values are different, then you are automatically outcast as the other that needs to be fought, not as the partner that needs to be engaged.
I think what is also interesting, and this has come again recently, is how the United States, especially the neocons, want a weak, disunited Europe.
Oh, yeah.
And Trump has actually passed the message. And this is, to be fair, this is a bit different to what Obama used to say. Obama used to tell the UK, if you leave the European Union, you're going to be at the back of the queue. Trump now has told the UK, now that you've left the EU, I'll put you at the front of the queue, and the deal that I have reached with you is better than the deal that I have reached with the European Union for you, because even in terms of tariffs, it is actually lower tariffs. Now, this is interesting because I think it shows something which we have to reflect about seriously. So once upon a time, we used to tell ourselves, we are coming together because together we will be stronger than the nation state. The European Union now, together, is weaker than the nation state. It is weaker than the nation state. If you see also how Canada, how Japan, how Brazil, not to talk of China, obviously, is dealing with the United States, they're actually weaker. So a bloc of 27 countries, which Macron himself, I think theatrically says, we did not reach a good deal because the United States does not fear us. No one is afraid of the European Union. I mean, of course, no one is afraid of the European Union. The European Union is not taken seriously anymore because it is so weak, And as I repeat, instead of facing the harsh realities it has to face to make its economy competitive, to produce goods which are good for the European market and for the rest, it withdraws into this very, very subservient relationship. And unless this is changed, the European Union is going to have very, very serious problems because it's going to become more ungovernable. The economy is going to be hit further. And what kind of relationship is it going to have with India? What kind of relationship is it going to have with 86% of humanity? Because at the same time, it wants to fight with China. I mean,
this is a stupidity beyond imagination. But Evarist, I have at this point, our friend Glenn Deason, he wrote an entire book about Europe finally figuring out again that it is just the Western Peninsula of Eurasia, right? That there's an entire different kind of geopolitical context also that Europe could and should embed itself in, and a reappreciation of what the world looks like, a transcontinental appreciation instead of a transatlantic one. But at this point, we do have the biggest roadblock in that in that way of reappreciating the world, especially the multipolar world, which is not the hegemonic dominated one anymore, is the fact that we have a now almost like 80-year, longer, actually nearly 100 years, created network of elites. And I had a talk about this with a young researcher, Neil Bonilla, on this channel, and she beautifully, like in an article, like showed how these elite networks are created in a way to foster, the next leadership of the different parties and so on, and how they're all transatlantic. So it doesn't really matter whether somebody is from the CDU, the SPD, left or right. I mean, they're all brought up in the same kind of elite networks, also in business and so on. So actually, the interests of that group, it's a small group, but it's a very significant group, is way further tied to Washington than it is to the European continent, or like, let to speak of the East or Africa in the South, right? So it's a sociological question to me at this point. At when do these structures break up? Because we've had similar things with the Soviet Union, right? All of the leaderships and so on of the Warsaw Pact members, they were tied to Moscow. And if you go to and look at Mongolia, all of the Mongolian, like, diplomats and so on of your generation, they were all educated in Moscow naturally, right? That's just how these satellite systems work, right? The elites are brought up in the center, and we still have in Europe an elite that is brought up in the center on the other side of the Atlantic. What do you think, also from your analysis and research, is this going to break up anytime soon, or is it, because at this point it looks like very, very resilient as a network system?
Yes, I would say that the network is very strong. And I think, without referring to any research, I can tell you from my own experience, looking at my colleagues in Europe, how, because of the age factor, and this is important, I noticed that the younger you are, the more vulnerable you are, for a very simple reason. You still have a life ahead of you. You still want to have a career ahead of you. So even while you might be the foreign minister of this country or that country, now what happens after my term is over? What think tank am I going to get into? What college? What American university? What American institution am I aiming for? Will I become a special envoy somewhere? So when you are taking a position, you are not thinking of how is this going to affect Europe long term, or how is it going to affect my people long term, the workers in my country, the industry in my country. Does this make us more sovereign? Are we deciding for ourselves? I think the main priority is, personally, my career. What position should I take to further it in the years ahead? And I can mention names of how these individuals become absorbed in this network, in this formidable network that you just mentioned, which then becomes a chain of command, because it's actually a kind of, we talk about supply chains and that we must not have dependent supply chains in business. The network that you're talking about is like a supply chain in policy making and in politics.
Yeah.
And yes, it's still strong. It's still strong. I think it will reach a crisis point. There is no doubt about it that it will reach a crisis point, the same way that those economists in the European Union that will not innovate and that will not change, and this is a big discussion now happening again in Germany, how are we going to innovate? Because they are losing out, apart from the fact, and this is also interesting, Pascal, if you look at the documents made available in the National Security Archive, one main priority was, do not let the Germans and the Russians get together again.
Was that in the National Security Archives as well? I thought it was just Brzezinski who wrote about that.
No. You even have policy documents actually telling you we must not at all costs let Germany and the Soviet Union, and they mention specifically Russia, be on good terms. We must always make sure that their cooperation, in fact, they did not like Brandt. They did not like Brandt. They did not like, Palme. They did not like the people who wanted a cooperative security architecture for Europe, who they did not want a common security uh, Europe, common security home, not only from Gorbachev, but not even from the Europeans. And I told you, Kissinger used to tell both Ford and the Bush, don't worry, don't worry. I mean, this is meaningless. It's just a document. We're just being a bit nice to the European left. But literally, you don't even have to defend it in Congress. We don't even have to defend it in Congress. We don't even have to discuss it in Congress because this is a kind of understanding. Well, to a certain extent, like the understanding between Trump and von der Leyen, because again, that's no agreement.
Yeah, but I mean, this is a misportrayal of what it is. And maybe this is the way that Kissinger tried to play it down, because the CSCE, the Helsinki Accords of 75, are definitely the beginning of the end of the Cold War, because it restructured the entire European relationship away from pure competition and confrontation into something more useful, actually, and a way for dialogue, which wasn't around. It just wasn't, and it did bear fruits down the road. It was the first time in since 45 that all of the major leaders again were sitting at the same table. Um, but yes, we can see how there are these forces in the US, and probably we had them probably everywhere, who thought that this is not their preferred way forward. This is not total domination.
Pascal, to a certain extent, is this not the same kind of attitude towards the United Nations?
Oh yes.
I mean,
Oh, yes.
there is a charter, there is an institution, there's a structure. But when it comes to the most important decisions to take, you don't care what the UN says, what the UN charter says, because literally speaking, even what CSC is doing is putting in a regional way what the UN charter says, no, about equality of nations, about, working together, about
Yeah, but
avoiding.
the CSCE seriously advanced the human rights, and yes, the West also abuses human rights horribly. That discourse, they do that constantly. But you can see today how this pushed forward the envelope, an envelope that actually Russia and China are picking up and saying, like, no, we are not against that. We are in favor of international humanitarian law, and human rights are as well something that they do not publicly oppose, even if they don't act in accordance with it. But it did push forward the idea of a structured exchange and common norms.
But what is interesting, Pascal, from these documents as well, and because these documents have been made available from the United States parts in presidential offices and libraries, and quite a number of them are actually Russian documents. You can see how Russian experts were telling Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and I think eventually Putin, but those documents are not available yet. They were telling them, listen, they are using the basket of human rights and humanitarian as a geopolitical tool against us, not only regarding Eastern Europe, but also Central Asia. They are going to encircle us again. It's interesting that already in the 90s, they were making reference that the United States will use the humanitarian basket to get countries like Azerbaijan and others away from the Soviet Union. So it wasn't happening only on the European front, but also in Central Asia. So this is interesting. That's why I think a study of those documents are interesting, because with hindsight, you would say, It was obvious this was going to happen. No, it wasn't obvious.
No. It's absolutely not obvious. If it was, it wouldn't develop that way. And we are only now actually understanding or starting to appreciate the complexity of that. Well, the elite network that was fostered, one pillar of hegemony, right? The NGO network that ever since the National Endowment for Democracy was taken out of the CIA, was put into charge to foster like these forms of civil society control mechanisms all over the place, and this worked for 40 years. We're learning, we're figuring that out only now. But in
What
this,
is
like, the
interesting,
United States
Pascal,
was a sorry, just one thing, is a master of packaging and then selling a
Pascal,
package.
I have lived through that myself. As a journalist, I was told that there is an interesting course by the Advanced African Journalism Center in Tunis, which you should attend. So I went there in 1984. And when we got there, I went to the office when they called us. That these were 70 journalists picked from all over the world. I came from Malta, but they were from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America. And we're going to have this 2-month course in Tunis about investigative reporting and about, quality journalism. We found out that actually it was being organized by a German political foundation and by the American USIS. So they were working together. At first, it was not clear, but then all our lecturers were American. All were American, and 3 of us were chosen to go to Stanford University, and I was one of them. So I have seen this in action, and what is interesting about American education is that it makes you reflect. It makes you think, and then you can use it also to analyze what is going on. So for me, it gave me a very interesting personal direct experience, how these networks that we were talking about work. Because then you have to decide, what the game is. Are you going to join it for your own personal advantage, or have you been made aware of it and then put it in your analysis of how these games are played? I chose the second route.
But that's why the US version of hegemony is so brilliant, because
Very
it doesn't work with direct coercion. It's a
Yes,
mix of a game of interests and
Gramsci,
maths. Because
Pascal.
Gramsci.
Coercion and consent. And most of the things that we are talking about is the result of the culture of consent. That the European Union is ready to be subservient to the United States is most of it is consent. It's not coercion. So that makes it more difficult to answer your question. When will this end?
And the cool thing in a democracy is that you don't need everybody on board, right? You just need a good majority of the people who matter. So you really just need to slice the right piece of the pie in order to then have this networked effect under which then institutions run after you and run in a way that is beneficial. So it's not even a conspiracy. It's really just playing the game intelligently and fostering the right forces in the right places. That's all.
And manufacturing fear becomes important then, because that's why play up Russia, that Russia is going to invade, so that you accept what we do with armaments and rearmaments. And one of the discussions that I enjoy having with young diplomats when I give lectures is to discuss this fear, how we manufacture fear, how it's important to talk about the enemy at the gate, because it helps you forget the problems at home, what it lies inside the gate, and you try to mobilize your critics in your favor to tell them, let's be united because there's an enemy at the gate. But also how this is manufactured and hardwired into our mentality, even when we look at the maps. And they look at me sort of, what are you saying? And I said, maps are manufactured. They are not. There's nothing automatic about having Europe at the center of the maps that we have, having it bigger when it's convenient and smaller when it's not convenient. Like, for example, the maps of the 50s showed the Soviet Union actually bigger than it is, to show that it's a very, very big threat. Look at tiny Europe. So if you see some NATO maps of the 50s, you would actually see the Soviet Union, which did not need to be bigger than it actually is, because it's rather big, actually geographically made to look bigger than Western Europe a lot, to really magnify the threat. But apart from that, also, although we are in a globe and the globe has no top and down and bottom, the way the map is laid out is that Europe and the United States are on top and the other continents are lower down. The problem is then how to make sure that there is division between Western Europe or Europe and Russia. That is important to keep it going, And one thing that you can tell how Gorbachev was sadly realizing what was happening, he kept saying, but pleading, from a very weak position, you are dividing Europe again. You are rebuilding a new wall. You're bringing in division again. This is not the common security home that we wanted to build from Portugal to Russia and beyond. It's so sad. The weakness comes out very, very clear. And privately, Bush tells Cole, even some of our American people here, I can't understand them. Bush is telling Cole, we have defeated the Soviet Union. So we're talking about a defeated power. So why should we respect a defeated power? They are a defeated power, and that is how we're going to deal with them. This is obviously said behind closed doors in Camp David. Publicly, it was, we can work with Gorbachev, we will have an US, NATO, Russia partnership, we will be together, we will look after your interests, don't worry. But that was all talk. In the real plan that was being carried out meticulously, it was, let us enlarge NATO and let us make the CSC, okay, it's there, it has served its purpose sometimes, but definitely not more important than NATO. So the CSC should have been the whole, no? And the NATO, if anything, the part. But the part became the whole.
Yeah, but it explains beautifully. People sometimes ask, where's the CSCE? Why don't we hear of it anymore? The answer is it has been defeated. I mean, the CSCE is a counter concept to the management of the European continent, and it lost to the NATO approach to the management of the continent, and that's why it's gone away. It's system theoretically useless. I mean, because it's otherwise the other one would have left. So it's a symptom.
But again, Pascal, it's interesting. From these documents, what emerges is Russian politicians and diplomats telling the Americans, your investment and all this energy into NATO is going to take away focus and energy and resources from the CSCE and from the OSCE.
Yeah, but we didn't understand. We didn't understand it at the time. We didn't capture it in these terms. So even the Russians couldn't capture it in these terms.
But they saw it coming. I must say that a couple of them saw it coming. Yeah.
Yeah, but in the Americas too. I mean, again, the George Kennan and Jack Matlock, they all saw that coming. One question though, since you read these papers, and you know also that even Bush argued in this very divisive way. Bush was the one who stood in the Verkhovna Rada in Ukraine in August 1991, telling them you should not split from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union should remain together. So why that? Because that's one of the points where you can say like, no, the Americans didn't want the outcome that actually then happened. But in a way, once it had happened, they were happy going along with it. But can you make sense of these crucial dates in 91?
But Pascal, as you yourself said, even when we're talking of either Europe or the United States, we're not talking of a homogeneous bloc where everyone has the same voice and everyone has the same line. So I think from this point of view, Clinton is to carry the responsibility for what happened. I think more than Bush.
Yeah, but you said in the documents you can see how Bush was already kind of, speaking out of both sides of his mouth. But then when it came
but not specifically about Ukraine.
Okay.
Definitely about the Baltics, about Poland, about Hungary. Though what is interesting is there is a discussion where Lech Wałęsa from Poland and Václav Havel from Czechoslovakia. Wałęsa is telling Bush, don't trust the Soviets. Don't trust Gorbachev. Because in one hand, they would have a pen, in the other hand, they would have a hand grenade. Václav Havel says, no, don't see it like that. We must have a good relationship with the Soviet Union, however much we transform our relationship with them and whatever happens to Russia. We must have a good relationship. But who won? It wasn't Václav Havel who won. It was Lech Wałęsa. So the process that you were seeing happening on the American side was also happening on the European side. And so we're now, the network and the elite that so far has survived is the one who has worked for the present situation, where we are faced with such deep division again between Europe and Russia. And we have to see how things are going to work out. Because this is so sad, and it doesn't have to be like this.
No, it doesn't. But it also just puts us into our own place, right? It means that you and we're just the latest iteration of the people who thought like Václav Havel. And
yes.
And on the other side, within our own communities, we have the Lech Wałęsas who viewing the Russians completely differently. Therefore, they take these other steps, and then they will cooperate with whoever offers the best deal for weapons and subsuming you into the other camp, right?
The difference now, Pascal, is obviously that the world has changed a lot. That Europe has declined further and is weaker, and at some point there is going to be a reality check where the European Union, to have a future, needs to reset its relationship with the rest of the world, including Russia, the United States, China, Latin America, Africa. Is it ready to do that? If it's not ready to reset that relationship, the decline of the European Union will be more dramatic, with painful consequences for the millions of Europeans living in our countries.
But it might also be sociologically inevitable at this point. If the networks and so on that have been fostered are so strongly entrenched, then we cannot get out of this. And then the question becomes at which point will the US be willing to sacrifice its acolyte continent in order to fight the Russians? I mean, what you have in Ukraine in a small form, you could do with the entirety of Europe. And I believe to see how the militarization of the European continent is done with that kind of purpose of creating a mega Ukraine in order to one more time push against the Russians.
But what is contradictory at the same time is that in the sort of agreement between Trump and von der Leyen accepted, though it's not clear. First of all, she does not have the mandate to do that, because we're talking of a deal where perhaps neither Trump nor von der Leyen have the mandate, because even Trump's power now to use national security considerations to push all these tariffs is being challenged in court, although perhaps the Supreme Court will eventually, if it is asked, it might come down in his favor. But definitely von der Leyen does not have the mandate to negotiate on behalf of the member states, energy supplies, investment by private companies, and the purchase of armaments from the United States. If America is going to provide most of the armaments that the Europeans want, how are they going to build their military industrial complex? Because they think that the military industrial complex is going to rebuild their economies. I mean, does it make sense economically? Leave aside the consideration of peace, war, etc. Does it make sense economically?
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to make sense economically.
Well, I have a strain of logic where it does make sense when you build military Keynesianism, which then also impoverishes the population. But an impoverished population is good if you want a big population to feed into the trenches, right? Because the only one who can still pay something is the military. So an impoverished, especially impoverished youth, is actually something that this kind of war system can work with, or prefers to work with, rather than a well-educated and well-fed population. So sadly enough, I do see a sense in this. The question to me is like, when will this be? Will we go down that route? Is the suicide?
But even that is debatable. There's an interesting discussion. I have a lot of respect for Kishore Mahbubani, the veteran Singaporean diplomat, who actually says that most of the products of the military industrial complex in the US are to fight the last war, not the next war. So they want to produce more tanks, to have more aircraft carriers, where even the war in Ukraine is showing us that the new war will not be fought like that. It won't be tanks. Those will be sitting ducks. An aircraft carrier is also a sitting duck when you're using hypersonic missiles, when you're using drones. So what military model is the European Union going to go for when it rebuilds its military industrial complex? Because Kishore Mahbubani makes a very compelling argument that even in terms of the military industrial complex in the States, it produces arms according to its own logic of profits rather than what is strategically needed in the 21st century. So even that is debatable, and there isn't a discussion about it.
No, and we are also learning that even the U.S. military-industrial complex has limits, and one of the limits is that the U.S. also deindustrialized over the last 30 years and is now lacking know-how how to do it. Plus, it needs those goddamn magnets from China. And this is not something you can fix very quickly.
Exactly. But that is why. But that is why, Pascal, when we're talking of the way forward for the world, that is why we need coexistence. At this point, I wouldn't even say how good to have peaceful coexistence. At least let's have unpeaceful coexistence, But we need coexistence because the alternative is, as we say, no existence. And even economically, we need each other. We need each other for resources. We need each other for the supply chains. We need each other for markets. So how can, and I find it difficult to understand, how can you have business leaders actually saying that the only business that we should do is with our friends, with a narrow basket of our friends? I had a speech by Lagarde and by Janet Yellen about this, that from now on, our business should be with a chosen narrow basket of friends. But I mean, what am I missing when I hear these words? How can your basket of friends, if they're made up of a small percentage of humanity and of countries in the world, provide you with the resources that you need, with the markets that you need, with the technology, how is it possible?
It's not stupidity, it's ignorance. When you think that the world is Western Europe plus North America, when you think that, then, well, that's the world, and we go back to the maps. But Evarist, we do have to come to an end. I would like to thank you very much for your beautiful analysis. Your article in the Times of Malta will be linked in the description below, and we will talk soon again. Thank you very much, Evarist.
All the best. Bye-bye.